This is a Fox News alert. We're only moments away from President Trump at the White House, where he will declare the national opioid epidemic a public health emergency. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. The president's action comes only hours after Republicans on Capitol Hill took a big step forward toward tax reform, narrowly passing a budget that lays the groundwork for a tax bill as early as next week. President Trump tweeting simply, "Big news, budget just passed!" Exclamation point indeed. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts joins me now. John, that was a big deal, actually.
It was a big deal having the budget passed because that now sets in motion, as you pointed out, the process for tax reform. President Trump has told members of both houses that he would like to get that done by Thanksgiving. That's probably not likely. Maybe he'll get it by the end of the year, maybe earlier in 2018. What you're looking at there's the East Room of the White House, where the president will make an announcement this hour on addressing the opioid epidemic. The announcement that he'll make today sets in motion a 90-day period in which the opioid epidemic will be attacked by the federal government on a public health emergency standpoint. The president will say in his speech this afternoon that the opioid epidemic currently sees 2 million Americans addicted. That was statistics as of the year 2016. 300,000 deaths from opioids since the year 2000. And the current rate is now 175 deaths a day. By declaring a public health emergency, that will allow the federal government to expand access to telemedicine, to increase access to anti-addiction drugs and mental health treatment for people, expedited hiring of specialists to respond to the opioid crisis, and increase access to substance abuse treatment for people in HIV/AIDS programs. While it is not part of the public health emergency, President Trump insisted to our Lou Dobbs on Fox Business last night that building a border wall is essential to fighting drugs, including opioids. Listen here.
The opioid is a tremendous emergency. What's going on there? The drugs pouring into the country have gotten, and I tell you what, we've made a big impact, but still, we need the wall. You know, part of the reason we need the wall is for drugs. Forgetting even about people, we need a wall for drugs.
Now, a lot of what the president talks about there is illicit drugs, but of course, one of the big opioids that just floods into the United States is heroin. And the president believes that building a border wall will cut the flow of heroin into the United States, at least from Mexico. The president getting some pushback, though, on his announcement this afternoon. Some Democrats saying, "Show me the money," pointing out that the budget that just passed the House today cuts money for Medicaid, which Nancy Pelosi says is a big source of funding for opioid addiction treatment. There is also concerns in some circles that the newly announced Department of Justice crackdown on drug crimes may put a lot of people in jail who should really be in treatment. Now, we should point out that this measure is temporary. It lasts for 90 days, but the Secretary of Health and Human Services, or the acting secretary that we have right now, can renew that as often as is deemed necessary. So this could go on for some time. Dana?
All right, John, thanks so much. And of course, if people end up in jail, then they have a record, then it's harder for them to work later. So there's a lot of things to be discussed today, and we are still waiting for President Trump. He will declare the opioid crisis a public health emergency. For more on this, let's bring in New Jersey Congressman Josh Gottheimer. He's a Democrat on the Financial Services Committee and co-chair of my favorite, the Problem Solvers Caucus, because we know we need more of those. Josh, the last time you and I were going to talk, I should call you Congressman. Yeah, I should, for full disclosure, I know you from a previous life.
Good, Dana.
I don't know if I can do that. You've earned the right to be called congressman. The last time we were going to talk, you actually had to reschedule because you were going to a memorial for somebody in your district who had died of an opiate overdose.
Yeah, it was. I remember that day. It was a memorial event. We lost a young man in the community who, during his years, he was playing football in college at Union. Really great kid. Everybody loved him. Promising future. And, you know, he started taking painkillers because of a football injury. And then this is what happens to too many families and too many young people. We have to deal with this. I don't care, rich or poor, where you're from. And I know, Danny, you've heard about this. It is ravaging communities all across America and in my district.
Well, and in New Jersey is ranked 25th out of 50 states. And D.C. For the use of it. But also, I thought this was a very troubling statistic. The number of heroin and morphine deaths in your state increased 214% from 2004 to 2015. So do you welcome the president's action today?
I think this is a very important step. You know, and this is not one of those partisan things at all. We all have to come together, Democrats and Republicans, to deal with this crisis and to face it. And I think the president declaring the emergency today is exactly the right way to actually face this. We all have to deal with it, and we've got to put the resources behind it to help people. All
right. Well, we certainly do hope it helps people. While I have you here, could we talk about tax reform for just a moment? The budget just passed. You did not vote for it. But
no.
You know what, Josh? I'm going to have to let you go. We're going to pause for one moment to let our Fox stations join us. All right, this is the Fox News continuing coverage of President Trump's speech on the opiate crisis. He's expected to declare a nationwide public health emergency. I'm Dana Perino in New York. I still have Congressman Josh Gottheimer with me. The budget just passed. You did not vote for it, but on tax reform, I'm actually told we have Chris Stirewalt here. Okay, Chris Stirewalt. I did not know who I was going to have. You're certainly a welcome surprise. Chris, the president on this opiate addiction, we're going to talk about the budget and the tax reform a little bit later in the speech. But you being from West Virginia, this is one of the states that's been ravaged by the opiate addiction problem. And do you welcome this action by the president? Do you think it will have an impact?
Well, I'm not here to welcome or unwelcome any initiatives of this government. The question I think that a lot of my fellow West Virginians are going to have, though, is why isn't it a national emergency? West Virginia was sort of the canary in the coal mine on this because the incidents, because of the heavy industrial work that took place in West Virginia, a lot of injuries, a lot of opioid prescriptions led to a lot of addiction and a lot of pill dumping. And that happened in West Virginia before it happened in a lot of other parts of the country. But now it is in every part of the country. Now it is part of our national life. And I think a lot of people who are on the front lines of this are going to wonder why this administration went for this lesser choice, which was to talk about a public health emergency and 90 days with those special authorities for public health officials, as opposed to a national emergency, which was what was first proposed and first considered, which involves more spending, more intervention, more stuff. And I think probably folks in West Virginia would want to know, why not go all the way?
All right. Well, we're going to keep you with us. And thankfully, they kept the congressman with us as well. Josh Gottheimer, you rejoined. We're going to wait for the president's speech on the opiate addiction as a national health emergency. But while we wait for that, I do want to ask you about tax reform, because the budget passed just narrowly. The president says that's a big win because it gives him the path to get to tax reform. They say a bill could actually be voted on next week. Could you see yourself as a fiscally conservative Democrat, somebody that could actually vote for this tax reform bill?
I think if we deal with the state and local tax deduction, and this is why you had several Republicans in my state, in New York, and others vote against the budget today, if we actually dealt with that, I could definitely see getting there. I mean, I'm really eager, like most, to see all the details next week so we can calculate out the impact on my district. But we need tax reform, we need to simplify the tax code, and we need lower taxes. So if I'm one of those that can get there if we can deal with this SALT issue.
It's interesting because a lot of people would say that if you're in a high tax state like New York, California, New Jersey, some of these New England states, if you're not in one of those states, you think, well, why should they get a deduction and I don't? I know that there's some numbers on that. If the Congress is able to come up with a compromise that would give a tax credit to people living in your district up to $350,000 a year, is that something then that you think could solve the problem and that you could go forward and vote for it?
You know, I've been working with the committee already to crunch the numbers and figure out exactly what's involved, because there's no income tax included in that credit. It's just property taxes. My big concern, and you made this point in a second ago, that people are raising is, what about these other states? Mm-hmm. New Jersey is where I live, top 3% tax-paying district in the country, which is why we have to get taxes down. But our return on investment is toward the bottom. We get back 33 cents for every dollar we send to Washington. West Virginia gets back $4.23. Mississippi, even more than that. So we're already funding it's huge transfer payments to other states. We're paying much more into the kitty than they are. And now to actually add another tax on top of it for our district is unacceptable. That's why I got to look at the math here.
What about and on the math, what if the president was able to say, okay, I could live with a new tax bracket for millionaires to help pay for that? Is that something that you could support?
Well, I'm not a higher tax person. I don't want to raise taxes. I want to actually let's look at I want to look at all the pay-fors when I get this next week and see how, and dig into the substance of it. And I don't really want to predict everything until I see the details, because I think that's the right way to govern. But let me just say that I could get there if the numbers work and if we deal with this issue.
So Minority Leader Pelosi had said earlier that basically she says she doesn't think that any Democrat should go for this. Are you going to be under pressure not to vote for tax reform?
I mean, I'm sure I'll be under pressure, but I work for the 5th District of New Jersey, not for a national party. So I'm going to look at the numbers, and what's best for my district is what I'm going to do.
So when you talk to the other members of the Problem Solvers Caucus, is there a way to get past the partisanship on this and try to deal with, what could arguably be the largest tax cut in American taxpayer history, but also a way to just sort of jumpstart the job creation in this country?
So, we had Gary Cohn in yesterday. He met with us, and we're 23 Democrats and 23 Republicans in the Problem Solvers Caucus, digging in on and trying to really dig in with him on tax reform to figure out how we get there. So, in other words, we're not the group of people who reflexively say no. We're actually trying to get to yes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we understand the benefits to the economy of actually getting our corporate tax rates down, giving broad-based relief, and we know that, at least I know, in my district, it's going to help create jobs and actually bring growth if done the right way. But again, these are where the details really matter, Dana. And what you saw today is why a bunch of Republicans voted against the budget, is because it hurts their district.
You have some people on the Republican side, deficit hawks, that are concerned about the spending. And, of course, the president about to announce a national public health emergency on the opioid epidemic, which will also require some significant funding. Do you think that is actually a problem for Republicans? Because they got close on health care, only to fail. Are Republicans overconfident that they are able to get tax reform done?
Well, this is where those details matter. The pay-fors that we're going to see next week are going to be critical, especially to the hawks and in this deficit hawks in the House and the Senate, and to many of us who want to make sure we're not piling mountains of debt onto the future. So this is where the details, as you know, Dana, matter more than anything, and why we've got to figure out these pay-fors.
All right. Well, Congressman Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Good to see you, Dana. Thanks.
All right, let's bring back Chris Stirewalt. He's Fox News digital politics editor. So you heard the congressman there say that he could get to yes. So might you actually see President Trump get to a point where he has bipartisan agreement and signs a tax bill that he arguably will say, well, that is the only thing that he really wanted to do was to make sure he dealt with ISIS, which he could check off the box that he thinks, and then deal with this. He would be looking at some pretty significant wins in his first year.
Well, that's a big if, and we also have to remember that there is the tax package is something they would like to do. They would like to this year deal with this because they want to, for the sake of political messaging, be able to say, so it started out rough, but we finished strong and it was okay, America. Sorry for the hiccups. That's all for political messaging. The stuff that has to pass this year is not easy because that relates to young adults who were brought to the United States illegally as minors, the so-called dreamers. It relates to keeping the federal government funded after the end of the year. Mm-hmm. It relates to raising the debt ceiling. It relates to the Iran nuclear deal. All those things are cans that the president and his fellow Republicans have kicked down the road all year, and they're all accumulated there in December. One of the reasons they're talking about doing it by Thanksgiving is they know it's going to be such a bloody battlefield around Washington once you get past Thanksgiving and into that there's going to be no hope. And if they don't get it done by then, they got to wait till next year. So the issue for Republicans is the B matter may get in the way of the thing they really want to do.
But they did make a significant step forward today by getting that budget passed. It only passed by 2. You had several, I think 20 members of Congress on the Republican side vote against it because of this issue that Congressman Gottheimer was just talking about, which is state and local tax deductions, which feels a little wonky when you're talking about it, but it matters to them. And I know that Chairman Brady of the Ways and Means Committee is trying to find a way to address their concerns. Do you think they'll be able to get that done?
Well, you think about if you're in bed, you got a blanket, you pull it up enough so that it covers your arms, your toes might get cold. That's what the Republicans are facing here on this legislation. They're trying to keep these people from these wealthy districts, like your previous guest. They're trying to keep those folks happy. But at the same time, if they do something to pay for that, like clamping down on how much deduction you can take for your 401k savings, how high that threshold is for your tax shelter. If they do that, that starts to hit middle class people who are saving for retirement, people who need to have a lot of money in there who are over 50. So wherever you go to get this 1.5 trillion, you're going to make somebody unhappy. The whole idea is build consensus around common issues and then nick away at the edges to talk about the price, the actual value of the numbers at the limits.
While we wait for President Trump to take the podium where he's going to talk about the opiate epidemic in the country, can you just take a step back? Pew Research Center did a poll over I guess it just released it, about partisanship in America, and especially splits within the Republican Party or conservative movement, but also the Democrats having the same. Are we just seeing a lot of party evolution within both of these parties? And is that helpful or hurtful to getting some things done?
Well, I confess, when you sent that to me this morning, I took their quiz. It's a fascinating quiz because it gets right to these hard. I love a quiz. I love a quiz, and it gets right to the heart of these questions about what makes us us and who are we really, because we think in terms of red team, blue team, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? But in truth, Donald Trump did not make America's political world the way that it is today. He is a result of that, he is a symptom, not a cause. He is a result, not the creator. In fact, these divisions date way, 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 way back. And when we think about the difference between what we would talk about Trump's base, and we saw actually in the Fox News poll that was out yesterday about how his support among white males without college degrees, the base of his base had slipped dramatically over the course of a month. Those voters, those America First voters, those guys, that's the Trump base. They're not particularly conservative when it comes to fiscal issues. They're not particularly conservative when it relates to trade, constitutional law, stuff like that. Their issue set is meat and potatoes. They're always going to be in conflict then with people like Jeff Flake, with people like Ben Sasse from Nebraska, for these constitutional conservatives who are in favor of free markets, free ideas, free trade, all of that stuff. Those two don't align well together. And the Democrats have a similar split that they see between the people who are Bernie Sanders kind of supporters, hardcore populists, versus sort of a more business-friendly or moderate or maybe even trade union Democrat on the other side. Those splits are important. Exploiting those is how parties keep the other one from succeeding. Parties succeed when they can find common ground between those divided groups.
Yeah, so we'll see what will happen. Chris, if you could stick around, because we're waiting for the president to make his remarks on the opiate epidemic. We are also following a major development on the anti-Trump dossier. This comes as the Justice Department lifts a gag order allowing a former FBI informant to tell Congress what he knows about the uranium deal with Russia, brokered while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is live in Washington. What's new, Catherine?
Well, thanks, Dana, and good afternoon. A short time ago, the House Speaker told reporters that the FBI is now finally cooperating, and the file should be to Capitol Hill within days.
We're so frustrated to have learned through the media aspects about this investigation that we've been asking for documents from the FBI for months. They have informed us that they will comply with our document requests and that they will provide the documents Congress has been asking for by next week, and we expect the FBI to honor that commitment.
Late last night, the Justice Department lifted the gag order allowing the informant to tell his story about the 2010 Uranium One deal to multiple congressional committees. The allegations include bribery by Russian officials and a concerted effort by Moscow to curry favor with then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton through a large speaking fee to her husband Bill Clinton and donations to the Family Foundation. This morning, the White House said the Democrats are in a weak position.
Everything that the Clinton campaign and the DNC were falsely accusing this president of doing over the past year, they were actually doing themselves, it turns out, and I think that this is a major scandal for the Democrats.
The ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee said this morning that this investigation, in his view, is partisan and a distraction.
This investigation is starting again for political purpose. This is another investigation of Hillary Clinton long after now she's no longer a presidential candidate, no longer the Secretary of State. Apparently, there's more interest in what happened 7 years ago with Secretary Clinton than there is in the Russia investigation, and that's quite by design.
The Republican chairman of the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee is putting the emphasis on transparency. Chuck Grassley said this morning he wants the informant to testify publicly. Dana.
All right, Catherine Herridge, thank you so much. We are still awaiting President Trump. He's going to take a major step in declaring opiate abuse in this country a public health emergency. Joining me now is John Walters. He's former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and the former drug czar under President George W. Bush. John, we see people gathering there. I know that the president is likely to be introduced by Mrs. Melania Trump, the First Lady, because this is something that she has taken on as one of her main issues, and she visited a pediatric treatment clinic. So before we get to that speech, it could be any moment now, how important is this moment to you? Did you see it coming?
Yeah, this data has been out for quite some time. I mean, we're looking at numbers of deaths in over 50,000 to go to 2015. This was during the Obama administration, except it was ignored and it was known. And I think what you see, too, is in campaigning for the presidency, I think both President Trump and Senator Clinton saw firsthand what you don't see in many cities, what you don't see in Washington, D.C., what you don't see sometimes among the elite, which is the devastation this is causing. And President Trump has spoken more aggressively about this than any president in my memory, and I worked for Ronald Reagan.
I remember when the 17 Republican candidates were up in New Hampshire and doing town halls. It was the first question all of them got, which was, sir, what can you do to help us if you become president to deal with the opioid epidemic? Do you think that this will actually make a dent in the problem?
I think this is a step in terms of treatment. There's obviously a need given the deaths, but we need to do more.
All right. Well, we see the First Lady, Melania Trump, taking to the podium. She will introduce her husband, the President of the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. Please sit down. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. It touches my heart to see the many familiar faces of the people I have been lucky to get to know over the last few months. Thank you for the time and strength it takes for each of you to tell your stories. We are here today because of your courage. The opioid epidemic has affected more than 2 million Americans nationwide, and sadly, the number continues to rise. We lost more than 175 Americans to overdoses every day, and millions more are struggling with addiction. As many of you know, addiction affects children in many different ways, and I have recently taken a larger interest in what I can do to help fight this epidemic. I have been participating in meetings and listening sessions, and I have been visiting with people who have been affected by this disease. I want to take a moment now to tell you what I have learned from the men and women on the front lines of this epidemic. Don Holman talked to me about his son Garrett, who took medication for ADHD and suffered from depression and anxiety. He explained that social media played a part in his son's erratic moods and behaviors. Garrett started to buy synthetic opioids online and self-medicated for his depression, passing away from an overdose just 8 days before his 21st birthday. Don Holman taught me that the stigma of drug addiction must be normalized, and talking about it is the only way to do that. Coach David McGee talked about his friend who became addicted after his pain medication were prescribed for sports injury. His friend died from an overdose, and through his tragic loss, Coach McGee taught me how important it is to educate kids, athletes, and parents, because his friend was not weak-minded. In fact, like so many of our kids today, he was competitive and strong-willed. Sabra Jean Collar, who is now in her 10th year of recovery, helped me learn that drug addiction is an effective disease, but with the proper support and medical attention, a person can move on to live a healthy and happy life. We are so proud of you for all that you have overcome, Sabra, and pray for you as you continue on this journey. Where are you, Sabra? Hello. of visiting Lily's Place in West Virginia, a recovery center for infants born addicted to drugs, I learned that to help babies succeed, we must help their parents succeed. By placing a priority of the whole family, Lily's Place is giving infants the best opportunity to thrive because their parents are being given the support and tools they need to succeed. I want to thank Rebecca Crowder and the staff at Lily's Place for their heroic efforts. Thank you. I have learned so much from those brave enough to talk about this epidemic, and I know there are many more stories to tell. But what I found to be the common theme with all of these stories is that this can happen to any of us. Drug addiction can take your friends, neighbors, or your family. No state has been spared, and no demographic has been untouched, which is why my husband and his administration has dedicated itself to combating this health crisis by using every resource available. I'm so proud to support him today as he sees this commitment through. I look forward to continue my work on behalf of children across the country and hope that citizens everywhere will join forces with this administration to help end this health crisis. Thank you very much for being here with us today. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you, Melania, for your moving words and for your devotion. I mean, it's a very deep devotion, I can tell you that, to our nation and its children. Thank you also to members of Congress, my cabinet, governors, members of Congress, state, local leaders, first responders, and healthcare professionals gathered here today. We have some truly incredible people in this room, that I can tell you. Most importantly, we acknowledge the families present who have lost a cherished loved one. As you all know from personal experience, families, communities, and citizens across our country are currently dealing with the worst drug crisis in American history, and even, if you really think about it, world history. This is all throughout the world. The fact is, this is a worldwide problem. This crisis of drug use, addiction, and overdose deaths, in many years, it's just been so long in the making. Addressing it will require all of our effort, and it will require us to confront the crisis in all of its very real complexity. Last year, we lost at least 64,000 Americans to overdoses. That's 175 lost American lives per day. That's 7 lost lives per hour in our country. Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of unintentional death in the United States by far. More people are dying from drug overdoses today than from gun homicides and motor vehicles combined. Think of it. Motor vehicle crashes, gun homicides, more people by far from drug overdoses. These overdoses are driven by a massive increase in addiction to prescription painkillers, heroin, and other opioids. Last year, almost 1 million Americans used heroin, and more than 11 million abused prescription opioids. The United States is by far the largest consumer of these drugs, using more opioid pills per person than any other country by far in the world. Opioid overdose deaths have quadrupled since 1999 and now account for the majority of fatal drug overdoses. Who would have thought? No part of our society, not young or old, rich or poor, urban or rural, has been spared this plague of drug addiction and this horrible, horrible situation that's taken place with opioids. In West Virginia, a truly great state, great people, there is a hospital nursery where 1 in every 5 babies spends its first days in agony because these precious babies were exposed to opioids or other drugs in the womb. They endure nausea, pain, anxiety, sleeplessness, and troubling eating, just the same as adults undergoing detox. Some of these children will likely lose one or both of their parents to drug addiction and overdose. They will join the growing ranks of America's opioid orphans. Such beautiful, beautiful babies. Beyond the shocking death toll, the terrible measure of the opioid crisis includes the families ripped apart and, for many communities, a generation of lost potential and opportunity. This epidemic is a national health emergency. Unlike many of us, we've seen and what we've seen in our lifetimes, nobody has seen anything like what's going on now. As Americans, we cannot allow this to continue. It is time to liberate our communities from this scourge of drug addiction. Never been this way. We can be the generation that ends the opioid epidemic. We can do it. We can do it. That is why, effective today, my administration is officially declaring the opioid crisis a national public health emergency under federal law, and why I am directing all executive agencies to use every appropriate emergency authority to fight the opioid crisis. This marks a critical step in confronting the extraordinary challenge that we face. As part of this emergency response, we will announce a new policy to overcome a restrictive 1970s-era rule that prevents states from providing care at certain treatment facilities with more than 16 beds for those suffering from drug addiction. A number of states have reached out to us asking for relief, and you should expect to see approvals that will unlock treatment for people in need, and those approvals will come very, very fast, not like in the past, very, very quickly. Ending the epidemic will require mobilization of government, local communities, and private organizations. It will require the resolve of our entire country. The scale of this crisis of addiction is why, soon after coming into office, I convened a presidential commission headed by Governor Chris Christie that has consulted with experts across America to listen, to learn, and report back on potential solutions. We await the final report, which will come in next week, and I know some of the report has already been seen because I want to see it as quickly as possible, and some of the things that they are recommending are common sense but very, very important, and they're going to have a tremendous impact. Believe me, tremendous impact. Today I will detail many of these aggressive steps with my administration, which we've already taken. After we review and evaluate the Commission's findings, I will quickly move to implement approximate and appropriate recommendations. But I want the American people to know the federal government is aggressively fighting the opioid epidemic on all fronts. We're working with doctors and medical professionals to implement best practices for safe opioid prescribing. And we will do something very, very special. We are requiring federally employed prescribers to receive, finally, special training. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has launched a prescription awareness campaign to put faces on the danger of opioid abuse. I want to acknowledge CVS Caremark for announcing last month that it will limit certain first-time opioid prescriptions to 7-day supplies, among other important reforms. And I encourage other companies to do their part to help to stop this epidemic. The FDA is now requiring drug companies that manufacture prescription opioids to provide more training to prescribers and to help prevent abuse and addiction, and has requested that one especially high-risk opioid be withdrawn from the market immediately. We are requiring that a specific opioid, which is truly evil, be taken off the market immediately. The U.S. Postal Service and the Department of Homeland Security are strengthening the inspection of packages coming into our country to hold back the flood of cheap and deadly fentanyl, a synthetic opioid manufactured in China and 50 times stronger than heroin. And in 2 weeks, I will be in China with President Xi, and I will mention this as a top priority. And he will do something about it. I am also pleased to report that for the first time, the Department of Justice has indicated major Chinese drug traffickers for and they have really put very, very strong clamps on them. They've indicted them, the drug traffickers, for distributing fentanyl into the United States. So, Jeff, thank you very much. Good job. Good job. And they've been indicted, and we're not going to forget about them. Believe me, they are doing tremendous harm to our country. The Justice Department is aggressively and really valiantly pursuing those who illegally prescribe and traffic in opioids, both in our communities and on the Internet. And I will be looking at the potential of the federal government bringing major lawsuits against bad actors. What they have and what they're doing to our people is unheard of. We will be bringing some very major lawsuits against people and against companies that are hurting our people, and that will start taking place pretty soon. We're also supporting first responders and medical professionals access to the tools they need to prevent deaths through life-saving overdose medications. At my direction, the National Institute of Health, headed up by Francis Collins, has taken the first steps of an ambitious public-private partnership with pharmaceutical companies to develop non-addictive painkillers and new treatments for addiction and overdose. So important. I will be pushing the concept of non-addictive painkillers very, very hard. We have to come up with that solution. We give away billions and billions of dollars a year, and we're going to be spending lots of money on coming up with a non-addictive solution. We will be asking Dr. Collins and the NIH for substantial resources in the fight against drug addiction. One of the things our administration will be doing is a massive advertising campaign to get people, especially children, not to want to take drugs in the first place, because they will see the devastation and the ruination it causes to people and people's lives. Watch what happens if we do our jobs, how the number of drug users and the addicted will start to tumble downward over a period of years. It will be a beautiful thing to see. I learned myself. I had a brother, Fred, great guy, best looking guy, best personality, much better than mine. But he had a problem. He had a problem with alcohol. And he would tell me, don't drink, don't drink. He was substantially older, and I listened to him and I respected, but he would constantly tell me, don't drink. He'd also add, don't smoke. But he would say it over and over and over again. And to this day, I've never had a drink. And I have no longing for it. I have no interest in it. To this day, I've never had a cigarette. Don't worry, those are only two of my good things. I don't want to tell you about the bad things. There's plenty of bad things, too. But he really helped me. I had somebody that guided me. And he had a very, very, very tough life because of alcohol. Believe me, very, very tough, tough life. He was a strong guy, but it was a tough, tough thing that he was going through. But I learned because of Fred. I learned. And that's what I think is so important. This was an idea that I had where if we can teach young people not to take drugs, just not to take them. When I see friends of mine that are having difficulty with not having that drink at dinner, where it's literally almost impossible for them to stop, I say to myself, I can't even understand it. Why would that be difficult? But we understand why it is difficult. The fact is, if we can teach young people and people generally not to start, it's really, really easy not to take them. And I think that's going to end up being our most important thing. Really tough, really big, really great advertising. So we get to people before they start, so they don't have to go through the problems of what people are going through. We are already distributing nearly $1 billion in grants for addiction prevention and treatment, and over $50 million to support law enforcement programs that assist those facing prison and facing addiction. We have also launched an $81 million partnership to research better pain management techniques for our incredible veterans. And soon, and by the way, Secretary Shulkin is here. You have done an incredible job for our veterans in a very short period of time. And soon, HHS will launch a task force to develop and update best practices for pain management across the federal government. I am urging all Americans to help fight this opioid epidemic and the broader issue of drug addiction by participating in the National Prescription Drug Take Back Day this Saturday. When you can safely turn in these dangerous and horrible drugs for disposal, that will be a wonderful, wonderful period of time for you. All of these actions are important parts of my administration's larger effort to confront the drug addiction crisis in America and confront it head on, straight on, strong. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. For too long, we have allowed drugs to ravage American homes, cities, and towns. We owe it to our children and to our country to do everything in our power to address this national shame and this human tragedy. We must stop the flow of all types of illegal drugs into our communities. For too long, dangerous criminal cartels have been allowed to infiltrate and spread throughout our nation. An astonishing 90% of the heroin in America comes from south of the border, where we will be building a wall which will greatly help in this problem. will have a great impact. My administration is dedicated to enforcing our immigration laws, defending our maritime security, and securing our borders. We also have to work with other countries to stop these drugs where they originate. We have no choice. We have to work with others. We have to get together because they have similar problems to what we have. Some countries have bigger problems than we have. Whether that country is China, whether it's a country in Latin America, it makes no difference. We're going to be working with all of them. We're taking the fight directly to the criminals in places that they're producing this poison. Here in America, we are once again enforcing the law, breaking up gangs and distribution networks, and arresting criminals who peddle dangerous drugs to our youth. In addition, we understand the need to confront reality right smack in the face that millions of our fellow citizens are already addicted. That's the reality. We want them to get help they need. We have no choice but to help these people that are hooked and are suffering so they can recover and rebuild their lives with their families. We're committed to pursuing innovative approaches that have been proven to work, like drug courts. Our efforts will be based on sound metrics and guided by evidence and guided by results. This includes making addiction treatment available to those in prison and to help them eventually re-enter society as productive and law-abiding citizens. Finally, we must adopt the most common-sense solution of all to prevent our citizens from becoming addicted to drugs in the first place. We must and are focusing so much of our effort on drug demand reduction. We must confront the culture of drug abuse head-on to reduce demand for dangerous narcotics. Every person who buys illicit drugs here in America should know that they are risking their futures, their families, and even their lives. And every American should know that if they purchase illegal drugs, they are helping to finance some of the most violent, cruel, and ruthless organizations anywhere in the world. Illegal drug use is not a victimless crime. There is nothing admirable, positive, or socially desirable about it. There is nothing desirable about drugs. They're bad. We want the next generation of young Americans to know the blessings of a drug-free life. In this enormous struggle against drug addiction, an opioid epidemic, it really is that. It is an epidemic. Our greatest hope is the same as it has always been. Through every trial America has encountered throughout our history, the spirit of our people and the strength of our character, we win. Each of us has a responsibility to this effort. We have a total responsibility to ourselves, to our family, to our country, including those who are struggling with this addiction. Each of us is responsible to look out for our loved ones, our communities, our children, our neighbors, and our own health. Almost every American has witnessed the horrors of addiction, whether it's through their own struggle or through the struggle of a friend, a coworker, a neighbor, or, frankly, a family member. Our current addiction crisis, and especially the epidemic of opioid deaths, will get worse before it gets better. But get better it will. It will take many years and even decades to address this scourge in our society. But we must start in earnest now to combat national health emergency. We are inspired by the stories of everyday heroes who pull their communities from the depths of despair through leadership and through love. Fire Chief Dan Goonan of New Hampshire, great state, runs a program, Safe Station, which allows drug-dependent residents to seek help at fire stations at any time. Jesse and Cindy Swafford of Dayton, Ohio, have provided a loving, stable home to children affected by the opioid crisis. I am calling on every American to join the ranks of guardian angels like Chief Noonan and the Swaffords, who helped lift up the people of our great nation. Together, we will care for our citizens, our children, and our orphans, and you know what I'm going to say, our foster youth. So many, but we're going to lift them up and we're going to take care of them. We will work to strengthen vulnerable families and communities, and we will help to build and grow a stronger, healthier, and drug-free society. Together, we will face this challenge as a national family with conviction, with unity, and with a commitment to love and support our neighbors in times of dire need. Working together, we will defeat this opioid epidemic. It will be defeated. We will free our nation from the terrible affliction of drug abuse. And yes, we will overcome addiction in America. We are going to overcome addiction in America. We have fought and won many battles and many wars before, and we will win again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you.
We've been listening to President Trump with a very moving, detailed, and strong speech as he announces that he has just declared, or he's about to sign a document declaring our opiate epidemic as a national emergency. He was introduced by First Lady Melania Trump, who the president said has a deep devotion to our nation and to the country's children. The president said that no parts of the country have been spared and that we can be the generation that ends the opiate epidemic. He spoke movingly about his own experience with his brother Fred, who was an addict to alcohol, and that he had constantly told his little brother, do not drink, do not smoke. And now you have President Trump about to sign this document. It will do a lot of things to encourage actually direct federal agencies all across to deal with this issue. Please stay tuned to Fox News Channel and this Fox station for continuing coverage of this story. I'm Dana Perino in New York. And as we watch President Trump sign this national emergency, I'm rejoined by John Walters, former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and the former drug czar under President George W. Bush. You also, sir, worked in the Reagan administration, and I heard a lot of themes there that reminded me of the Just Say No campaign, which did work for me. A lot in this speech. What was your biggest takeaway?
Well, I think it's an excellent speech. I mean, it was covered all the parts. It covered the importance of demand reduction and treating people who are suffering. It covered the important parts of supply reduction to stop these poisons from killing people. And it talked about what we have to do as a nation. This is about a choice and character. It's a speech that reminded me too of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, and is a speech that you didn't hear for too long here. We vilified police, we minimized responsibility, we hid this problem, and I think President Trump deserves a lot of credit, as does Mrs. Trump, for stepping up and really making this a top priority.
One of the things I thought was very interesting, and I don't know if we have this sound, but I'll just summarize it here, was the president talking about a new public-private partnership, working with the National Institute of Health, directing them. And we do have that. Let's listen to that.
At my direction, the National Institute of Health, headed up by Francis Collins, has taken the first steps of an ambitious public-private partnership with pharmaceutical companies to develop non-addictive painkillers and new treatments for addiction and overdose. So important. I will be pushing the concept of non-addictive painkillers very, very hard. We have to come up with that solution.
I often hear people ask that. I myself have asked that. Why can't all of our great scientists have an innovation that changes the type of medication that would address pain but not have this problem of the addiction?
Well, there are certain formularies. They were downplayed in the effort to kind of drive large, potent opioid medications at people over the last 15 years. We've seen the consequences of that. There also are other therapies for pain that weren't considered. So now you're seeing a broadening of this, and I think it's very important to have this kind of initiative driven by the White House and by the key researchers at NIH.
We also are joined by Bill McGurn. He is a Wall Street Journal editorial and a columnist. He writes the Main Street column, and you can see it every Tuesday. And he was also a speechwriter for President George W. Bush. As far as speeches go, Bill McGurn, what did you think?
I thought it was very good. I thought the president expressed compassion for the human costs of this addiction. It wasn't, when you talk about a public health crisis, it can be very abstract and clinical, and that was not at all his speech or Mrs. Trump's speech. I think they understand the human costs. It's interesting. My family, going back, is sort of like President Trump's family. We've had family members that we called either practicing alcoholics or non-practicing alcoholics. So I can relate to the president's take on this. It's a terrible thing when you lose a life to that. It's a tremendous thing when you can reclaim a life from addiction. So I would just say that I thought a lot of the meat of it was quite good, but I do think that a lot of the emphasis is it's not just treatment. A lot of people that are in these problems refuse treatment, or they stick with treatment for a few weeks and they drop out, and that's the kind of thing that I think has to be addressed. And I think I'd like to see a lot of emphasis on local solutions, because people can come up with different things. The boss that we used to work for, George W. Bush, talked about these faith-based programs, where you had someone that really cared about you, that was a partner. I mean, I don't know anyone that's gone through addiction and beat it by himself.
Generally you used to say that government can't heal a heart. John Walters, I wanted to ask you about this. There is a concern about the over-criminalization of this. And so the president talked about getting people that are in jail some treatment that they need. But then when you leave, one of the problems, as I understand it, is that people start using again, but they can't get jobs because now they have a criminal record. So is there anything that can be done in this national emergency to address that?
Yeah, I think we're already looking at that, and I've talked actually with people in the current Justice Department with Attorney General Sessions. We have drug courts and diversion programs for people who are basically in the criminal justice system because they have an addiction problem, are not violent, predatory individuals, are not big drug traffickers. The federal government does actually a pretty good job today sorting that, and this has kind of been a false issue raised by President Obama and Eric Holder that we're locking up people of color. That's not what's going on, and we're sorting. And in fact, we're not charging the people at the higher levels. We can use drug courts and diversion programs to not leave people with a criminal record at the end of this, to rehabilitate them, and to make their lives productive. One of the keys in this speech also is cut off the fentanyl that's coming from China. That's a very important matter, and I'm very pleased to see him say he's going to make that a top priority.
On his trip, and the president goes to Asia. Bill McGurn, can I ask you one other question?
Sure.
This is one about national politics. So I saw a poll yesterday, and I think it was the AP, saying that 51% of Republicans now support legalization of marijuana. You see all across the country, states like the one that I come from, Colorado, you have legalized marijuana. It's becoming part of the culture, and yet the president just gave a very impassioned plea for his generation to tell kids, don't even start this in the first place.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, I don't think they're contradictory necessarily. Just because something's legal doesn't mean you have to do it. I don't know any parent that would like to see their kid go down that path, start on that path. It's just fraught with a lot of peril. I also think that now that we have some states that have legalized, we're going to find it's not all sweetness and light the way we've been promised in some cases. So, I'd like to see states look at it, look at the actual experience, look at the unintended consequences, and again the human costs of doing this in some places. So we might get a better debate as we get more details about what in fact really does happen when you legalize marijuana and what doesn't. Before, it was very abstract.
John, the president said we can be the generation that ends the opioid epidemic. That is a bold goal. Achievable?
Sure. Two things. Care for people, cut off the poisons here. We do that every day. We're cutting off the threat from terror. Every day we don't have a terror attack. We've stopped a small number of people with dangerous substances. This is a bigger target. We can do a better job. We have to focus. He's right. The wall will help. It's not the answer alone. It'll help. And on the marijuana question you ask, I think that's important. It's a big mistake to start kids using, because we now know that marijuana in the state of Colorado, it now has the highest rates of opioid use and abuse, as well as other drugs, because it's allowed initiation with marijuana. It's not true that this is compartmented. It makes lives worse.
All right, well, the president's saying that we will defeat this epidemic. John Walters and Bill McGurn, thank you, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dana Perino. It's been a very interesting hour. The president giving a very impactful speech on the opiate crisis. Stay tuned for more from Shepard Smith.